All propaganda is lies, even when one is telling the truth, wrote George Orwell, one of the greatest writers of 20th century. At first glance, it sounds contradictory. How can a truth be a lie? But Orwell's point wasn't about factual accuracy. It was about control.
आईएसआई का नाम नहीं आना चाहिए.
He wrote this while working at BBC's radio department in 1942. His task was, and I quote, alleging in his newsletters that Japanese are plotting to attack Russia, which even he don't believe this to be the truth. But the propaganda was, if Japanese do attack Russia, we can then say, I told you so. If Russians attack first, we can pretend that it was Japanese who started it. If no war breaks at all, we can claim that it was because Japanese were too frightened of Russians. It was narrative manipulation at the height of World War II. But Orwell wasn't confessing his guilt here. What he was doing was diagnosing a system.
और कल से कोई पॉलिटिशियन पावर में आता है जिसे वाकई में हमारे देश की फिक्र हो तो ये सारे सबूत काम आ सकते हैं.
For him, propaganda didn't care for what is truth. With Japanese Navy in Indian Ocean, Britain was desperate. India became the center of the war. But India, colonized, restless, angry, refused to be at the center of it. This is where Orwell's thinking sharpens. Born in India, he said, what answer can we make of the Japanese cry of Asia for Asiatics? Only that the Japanese claims were lies, and that their rule would be more worse than our own. It is true, but it is not inspiring. By helping China and freeing India, we should have appropriated Asia for Asiatics to our own use and turned it from a lie into something at least approaching a reality. And the one sure way of arousing their enthusiasm is to convince them that Indian independence is only possible if Britain wins the war and impossible if Japan wins it. Without a false hope of Indian independence, Britain's propaganda was gonna collapse into a lie. He ends it with, all propaganda is lies, even when one is telling the truth. But I don't think this matters, as long as one knows what he's doing and why. And this last line is what holds the true essence of his thought. His point was simple. He didn't care if the propaganda was true or not. He cared about what it was used for. And in war, usefulness replaces honesty. It's no different than Yudhishthir using a facet of truth. A sentence that was technically true but emotionally deceptive. To kill Dronacharya in the war of Mahabharata. A war in which Pandavas had to bend every rule in order to beat Kauravas. And that's also what Dhurandhar deals with. War. Not just a war between two countries, but also between two civilizations, India and Pakistan. While one kept getting invaded time after time to the point of barbarians knocking at their doors,
कश्मीर घुसे, कारगिल घुसे.
the other justified brutality in the name of religion.
हिंदू बहुत ही डरपोक कौम है.
And even when it draws from the event laced in reality, it is quickly labeled propaganda
I really don't care about them because the whole point is that I know where it's coming from.
by a section of society.
Agenda-driven critics थे.
And this isn't unique to our region or our culture. Some of the most defining stories of our time arrive at this exact moral crossroad and gets labeled as propaganda. In one of my favorite animes, Attack on Titan, humanity has retreated behind massive walls,
その日人類は思い出した
living in a constant terror of titans,
奴らに支配されていた恐怖
giant beings who roam the land, devouring them.
鳥かごの中に囚われていた屈辱を
The story starts with them knocking the door down. Somehow this got banned in many countries, including China, and got labeled as anti-Semitic propaganda. In Sicario, the American war on drugs has started to take more lives than their war on terrorism,
Nothing will make sense to your American ears.
to the point that now civilians are dying every day in cross-border terrorism.
But in the end,
This was also labeled as state-sponsored propaganda
you will understand.
for the kind of torture method it justified. Across all these stories, the pattern repeats because cultures don't choose their stories. Stories surface what cultures are trying to forget. In all of these tales, the protagonist faces an extinction level threat, has to make a choice between either becoming what he fears or be erased by it. And not so surprisingly, they always choose to become the very thing they are fighting. In Attack on Titan, after Eren Yeager discovers that Titan are actually humans, he responds with the same violence once used against his people,
タイナ、
killing billions in his wake,
お前と同じだよ。
concluding that a weak nation like his must build an army and strike first to survive. In Sicario, Alejandro chooses to cross the border, just as his enemies did,
You will not survive here.
an exact revenge,
You're not a wolf.
accepting that morality alone cannot defeat the brutality
And this is the land of wolves now.
and bring back the ones he loved. And this is also why Dhurandhar fascinated me. Much like these stories, it also begins from the perspective of
पड़ोस में ही रहते हैं हम.
institutional helplessness.
कूदे भर का जोर लगा लो और बिगाड़ लो जो बिगाड़ सकते हो.
Similarly, Hamza isn't a patriot by design. He's what a civilization produces when it feels cornered. The moral choices given to him are rare, even for a spy film, let alone a mainstream Bollywood movie.
यूएन से भीख मांग ली
With no allies
यूएस का आगे किरदार है
and faced with constant brutality, India responds by adopting Pakistan's method,
बेटा नाम क्या है?
sending her own barbarian to settle the score.
हमजा अली मजारी
When Hamza, being undercover, has to join a gang while maintaining his cover, he risks the life of an underage boy
बचा लूंगा लड़के को
to achieve his goals, but he dies in spite of it. A Pathan or a tiger would never have done that. A typical Bollywood hero would never do that. It's a highly moral choice kept in front of him, right from the get-go. It's a heart-wrenching tale, where his own actions for safeguarding his nations causes the deadliest attack on it.
अगर आपको इस हमाम में उतरना है तो नंगा तो होना पड़ेगा।
In every one of this tale, the heroes become monsters or killing machines,
गाड़ी रोक।
so their people can stay human. That's the hidden cost of these stories. They glorify the individual who breaks themselves, and we repeat that same mistakes in our lives. We too try to do everything: wait, clerk, account, manage, until we lose the human spark that started it all. But growth shouldn't demand this, and that's where Odoo comes in. It's not just a software, but a system that takes the mechanical burden off your shoulders. Instead of you becoming the gear that turns the machine, Odoo suites of application cover all your business needs. Thanks to their 45 plus integrated apps like CRM, e-commerce and accounting, they become the engine for you. They replace the old chaos of redundant and manual tasks with smart automations. And now that the apps are fully integrated, they talk to each other. When someone inquires through a website, it's already a lead in CRM. When you reimburse an expense, it gets recorded in your ledger and sales. This scales with you, whether you are a bootstrap visionary like Rahman Dakat or a multinational like Major Iqbal. Best of all, if you have a specific need, your first app is free for life, and you can access their whole suite of apps for just 580 rupees a month per user. So if you want someone to share your burden so you don't lose your spark, check out Odoo. The link is in the description. In every one of this tale, the heroes become monsters or killing machines,
गाड़ी रोक।
so their people can stay human. But history shows us that violence never stays contained. The protector always carries the scars
गाड़ी रोक दे मादर।
long after the war ends. But still, they all get called propaganda. If all propaganda is already a lie, even when one is telling the truth, then the only matter should be knowing why we are doing it. And no medium understands this manipulation better than cinema. A heroic close-up is already an argument. A swelling score is a moral cue. An omitted consequence is a lie. The deception exists between the shots, not inside them. This is why film is uniquely suited for propaganda. It presents arguments as experiences.
Every night, you have families killed.
Cinema doesn't say this is right.
Tonight should be no different.
It makes you feel it is. And this is where it becomes something more than entertainment. It becomes a space where civilization rehearses their unresolved past. In many ways, these stories attempt to rewrite the narrative societies tell about themselves.
सर मुंह तोड़ने के लिए मुट्ठी बंद करना जरूरी है
India, long associated with the image of peace,
We must infiltrate the very core of terrorism in Pakistan.
is beginning to explore the conflict buried under that narrative. Attack on Titan mirrors Japan's ongoing debate about militarization and sovereignty.
調査兵団を失うということは
After being under US Army for the last 70 years,
人類の矛を失うことを意味します
Sicario dismantles the illusion of clean warfare. The American backyard becomes a world where justice and cruelty is indistinguishable.
Who do you think we learned it from?
It shows that nations determined to survive rarely stops at defense. They expand, compete, and assert dominance.
Do you think the people that sent you here
If that's an inescapable pattern,
are any different?
then why does admitting it still feels taboo? Perhaps because India itself has always lived between two moral visions. Gandhi's belief that violence corrupts freedom, and Netaji Bose's conviction that freedom demands sacrifice. This tension isn't new, it's civilizational. Why is it that when a colonized civilization begins using the same methods, selection, framing, emotional emphasis, not to control its people, but to reconnect with its roots, get labeled as propaganda? Why can't we rewrite our own history to no longer be about domination, submission, but about reclaiming dignity? I think because true dignity isn't found in sanitized version of the past or in the liberal idea of a non-violent utopia. It comes from facing our own truth and refusing to look away. The modern anti-hero, a figure who commits dark acts for a perceived greater good, is often seen as a corruption of our values. But these characters are new. We resonate with these characters because they feel like a return to something familiar, a truth long buried under layers of selective memory. This conflicts and violence in our history isn't an anomaly, it's part of who we have always been. This leads us to one of the most striking acts of narrative erasure in Indian history. For centuries, one of the most powerful emperor in Indian history was forgotten. It was only in 19th century, under colonial rule, that a British scholar named James Prinsep deciphered the Brahmi script, and Ashoka re-entered our history.
और युद्ध एक सत्य है
But rediscovery is never neutral.
और युद्ध में या तो जीत होती है या मृत्यु.
Whoever brings the past to light also frames how it will be understood.
मैं जीता हूँ.
Colonial historians emphasize Ashoka's remorse after the Kalinga War,
हाँ आप जीते हैं.
his embrace of Buddhism, his rejection of conquest,
विधवाओं के आंसू,
his moral transformation.
अनाथों की चीखें.
What faded into the background were many incidents of violence that hid even after adopting Buddhism.
सब जीत गए हैं आप.
In one instance, a non-Buddhist and a Jivika drew a picture of showing Buddha bowing at the feet of Mahavira. On complaint from the Buddhist devotee, Ashoka issued an order to arrest him and subsequently another order to kill all the Ajivikas in the whole area.
अब ये नहीं रुकेगा विराट.
Around 18,000 followers of the Ajivika sect were executed as a result of this order.
आप जीत गए.
This wasn't necessarily deception because the most powerful propaganda doesn't invent lies.
うまい嘘のつき方を知っとるか。
It decides which truth deserves to survive.
時折
And this selection is the subtlest form of it.
事実を混ぜて喋ることじゃ。
Similarly, in Attack on Titan, Commander Erwin reaches a similar realization.
壁の外に人類がいないってどうやって調べたんですかと。
He notices that history books inside the walls states with certainty that all humans outside are dead.
それなのに歴史書は食い尽くされたと断言している。
Even though no one had the means to verify it,
食い尽くされたと思われると表記するのが正しいはずだ。
as no one has ventured enough distance outside the wall, the wording itself revealed propaganda. Someone wanted the population to stop questioning.
歴史書を発行する王政側の意図だ。
It shows sometimes control begins not with censorship but with grammar. Because when a colonized civilization learns about its past through the lens of its colonizers, they don't just inherit history, they inherit an interpretation of themselves. If the greatest emperor India has ever seen is remembered primarily as a pacifist, then the violence that we feel necessary at any point in our lives, however just, begins to feel culturally alien. Even when our stories suggested otherwise. By controlling the past, one can quietly shape the emotional limit of their present and the future, while also binding a historical figure to their whims. We were sold a lie that we belong to a peaceful civilization. We are told violence is a deviation from who we are. Yet somehow, time and time again, we Indians instinctively relate with violent, immoral heroes who are highly divisive as they don't follow the morals we are taught in school. Socialist Joseph Ludwig Fischer says that a man can escape his city, his society for a while, but never his culture. What it tells us is that the violent impulses we feel today are not signs of our moral decline, that we have not strayed from the purity of our ancestors. They were as flawed and by definition as human as we are right now. That the eruption of this feeling through films, politics, and public discourse is not an anomaly, but a pattern of suppressed memory. Because when societies forget their past violence,
In fact, evidence has shown
they don't become peaceful,
that directly or indirectly,
they become unprepared.
इस दुनिया में हो रहे almost हर terrorist attack के पीछे पाकिस्तान का हाथ है.
Empires don't disappear when they renounce violence. They disappear when they pretend they never needed it. Revisiting the violent realities of figures like Ashoka isn't about glorifying bloodshed, but about reclaiming a history that was oversimplified by an education system filled with liberal ideas. In doing so, we realize that our ancestors wrestled with the same struggles as we do, and our understanding of Indian identity was often shaped by selective storytelling. This colonial habit of brushing things under the carpet mirrors one of the most unsettling weapons in Attack on Titan:
レイスケは人類の記憶を都合よく改ざんできるというわけじゃ。
the power to rewrite collective memory.
そんなことが。
In the story, the monarchy erases knowledge of the outside world, trapping citizens in a peaceful existence that is actually a prison. They are led to believe that the Titans are a natural disaster rather than the result of a political history. Just as generations grew up with an image of Ashoka centered on pacifism, often overlooking the harsh realities of his reign, the citizens of Wall are fed with a narrative of true peace that demands they suffer
巨大な壁を築くことで人類を守ったのだ。
for the sins of ancestors they aren't even allowed to remember. This brings us to the ultimate realist realization. Eren Yeager, like the architects of Dhurandhar program,
तुम्हारा उद्देश्य
concludes that a nation surrounded by enemies
सिर्फ पाकिस्तान में घुसना नहीं है,
cannot afford the luxury of a textbook ethics.
पूरे जंगल पे राज करना है.
If the world sees us as monsters, the only way to survive is to become the monster they fear.
Dhurandhar isn't exhausted with the relentless display of too much testosterone's hyper masculinity.
The final stage of propaganda is when people begin to defend the narrative themselves, believing that it was always their own.
So people who label it as propaganda, I don't care about them. I really don't care about them because the whole point is that I know where it's coming from.
When modern critics label these stories as
An inflammatory anti-Pakistan narrative.
they are often reacting to the discomfort of seeing their ideal India dissolve into life's brutal reality.
And I feel it's the propaganda in their head which is making them look at this film as propaganda.
They call it a lie because it portrays a version of ourselves that isn't inspiring or pacifist enough for them.
An audience is actually very, very smart.
Cinema becomes a propaganda not when it lies, but when it challenges the lies we are comfortable living with.
जब वो देखते हैं उनको समझ में आता है कि कौन सी फिल्म प्रोपेगेंडा है और कौन सी फिल्म का इंटेंट करेक्ट है.
The real question isn't whether Hamza or Eren are good men, but whether they resonate with a deeper cultural memory.
इसीलिए घातक हूँ.
One that recalls figures like Bhishma and Ashoka not as saints, but as leaders who bore the burden of violence so their people wouldn't have to.
What is Operation Dhurandhar?
Why can't we rewrite our history to be about reclaiming dignity? Because reclaiming dignity requires us to admit that we are capable of the same violence as our enemies.
हम अपना asset उनकी gangs को infiltrate करने भेजेंगे.
The tragedy isn't that violence is inherited. The tragedy is that every generation believes it will be the last to need it. In the end, it's not about whether these choices are good or bad. It's about whether we have the courage to acknowledge them.
हम इस operation में criminals को induct करेंगे.
As Eren Yeager questions while standing in front of the ocean, if we kill every one of our enemies out there, will we finally be free then? In Dhurandhar, Sanyal's wish in the end isn't that Dhurandhar program to give us the greatest patriot.
And if we succeed,
It's to create the greatest killing machine ever made.
we might just have a killing machine in our hands.
Perhaps the answer doesn't matter about what is propaganda, as long as, like Orwell suggested, we know exactly what we are doing and why we are doing it. Thank you. If you like my videos, please subscribe to my channel.
मजा आया मादर.